Hello again. So this is lesson 6 in the course on the general training module for IELTS, specifically writing task 1, so the letter. So in this lesson, I'm going to talk about a formal letter to someone you don't know. So this is one of the 3 types of letters you'll need to know before you do the exam. The other 2 you can find in lesson 5, a formal letter to someone that you know, and in lesson 7, an informal letter. So the material you're going to see in the lesson can be found on my website, IELTScompass.com. And if you go to the website, the link is below this video if you're seeing it on YouTube, or if you're on the website, you can find the lesson notes below the video. Okay, so let's have a look. Okay, so here's our letter. If you look down at the bottom, dear sir or madam, so if you check that, the first thing that you check when you get your question on the test is that part. You'll know whether you're writing to someone you know or someone you don't. And in the case of dear sir or madam, it's someone we don't know. And so, of course, it is a formal letter. So in this case, public library wants to make improvements to their services and facilities. In order to get ideas from the public, they have asked library users to send them suggestions in writing. So again, the purpose of your letter is to make suggestions. So you could either write, I'm writing to suggest, or you could write, I'm writing in response to your request for suggestions. But the purpose of the letter is to make a suggestion as requested by the library. So what do we need to do? Describe some situations, things that we like, things that we don't like, and of course make a suggestion. Now this should be related to say what you don't like. You might mention several things that you don't like, but you should be responding to your suggestion should relate to the things that you mention that are a problem. So it'd be a bit silly to mention one group of things that you don't like and then make suggestions about changing something else. Sometimes that 2 of these bullet points will be related to each other. Okay, so dear sir or madam, I am writing to respond to your request for suggestions. If you don't know a phrase like that, I am writing to suggest or to make some suggestions about improvements you could make to the library's facilities and services. If you, in the planning phase, did what you were supposed to do, that means thinking of some vocabulary related to libraries and library facilities or library services, then you don't need to worry about your vocabulary score, most likely. Assuming your level of English is about where it needs to be, then the level of vocabulary that you have should be fine. And if it's not, there's no way that you can trick the examiner into thinking that your English is better than it is. So in that case, you have to just improve your English. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to inform you that I use the library often and am pleased about the opening hours and the friendly and helpful library staff. Fairly simple. I focus most of my information on the second part, say what I don't like. There are, however, a few things which I find unsatisfactory about the library at present. Mainly the selection of newspapers and magazines is quite limited as it contains only local periodicals. So periodical is newspapers, magazines, journals, etc. Another problem is the waiting time for access to the library's digital collection. So essentially, when I was planning for this letter, I just did a bit of brainstorming about vocabulary related to libraries, and then put that in. So, if you say, what it says is, say what you don't like, but they say make suggestions, plural. So when they ask you for something in plural, it's generally easier for you to do it that way. At this point in time, August 2020, it is acceptable to write 1 when they ask for plural. But there's been talk of that changing, and generally what you want to do is make your job easier. So if you've only got one idea, that means you've got to add a lot more about that idea, a lot more detail, a lot more development. And so having that level of detail, for the most part, is more difficult. You might have an idea that's easy to do. But generally, if you have 2, you can easily give enough detail to satisfy the development requirements for a high score, and also not have to, write a book about your one single idea. So the other problem is waiting time for access to the library's digital collection. I often do research in the digital archives while on site and sometimes have to wait for more than an hour to use the computer terminals. So here I have explained why that's a problem. I haven't explained why this first one is a problem about the periodicals, but the reason I did that is simply because I had all this vocabulary that I brainstormed. So tailor your letter to the way that you've prepared, your knowledge of vocabulary, your ability to communicate about what you're writing about, and that's how you do well on the test. So if I hadn't thought of this vocabulary, I probably wouldn't have written this sentence about research, and that would be okay. So on to the third part. The most important suggestions I can make are to expand both your periodicals collection and the number of computers available for use by the public. So essentially, the solution I've come up with is the suggestions I've come up with are directly related to the two problems that I've mentioned. So local periodicals and lack of availability of computers. So alternatively, instituting an appointment system would ensure that patrons have convenient access to digital services. So again, you're going for the sort of overall level of development, and you can either explain things in greater detail, or you can have more items that you talk about, as long as you talk about them in enough detail. And enough detail simply means that you are explaining why you're using the example that you're using, or you're talking about what you're talking about in relation to the question, so that it's clear. As long as you do that, that's fine. Yours faithfully, and my fake name, Coco Bonsai. This is something, yours faithfully, just whenever you do a formal letter to someone you don't know, always use that, or you could say faithfully yours, but it doesn't matter. Just do the same thing every single time. So if we have a look, fixed phrases for letter writing in red, cohesive devices in green, referencing devices in orange. I'll talk about those in a minute. And less common vocabulary in blue and purple. Two colors for multiple examples in the same sentence just means that sometimes often good vocabulary is multiple words in a phrase. And so if I've got like two multiple word phrases right next to each other, one is blue, one is purple. Perhaps not so much in this letter, but often when students will read an example letter, they're surprised by what's considered good vocabulary. It's not often just single words, it's often phrases, and often phrases of common words that are used together. Let's have a look. So I'm writing to respond to your request for something. Okay, suggestions. Suggestions for improvements. I believe that comes suggestions and then improvements. So that's from so suggestions for improvements is also a good phrase, but again, that's from the question. Same with facilities and services. That's good vocabulary, but if it's from the question, you don't get credit for it. First of all, I would like to inform you that, again, that's a very formal phrase for giving someone information. Pleased about something is a good phrase to use. Extensive opening hours. Opening hours is fine, but extensive opening hours is a less common variation of that. Friendly and helpful staff, those are words that go together. Make my visits enjoyable and productive. So those work well together. However, again, transition, going from things that I like to things that I don't like. So if you look at the letters, but especially task 2 essays in the Cambridge books, the ones that are written by examiners, what you will notice is you see some, first of all, in addition, therefore, but most of the consistent use of cohesive devices is for transition signals, so changing from one type of information to another type of information. So however, on the other hand, in my opinion, making it clear that you're giving an opinion in conclusion, okay, now we're at the end of my essay. So overuse of cohesive devices can keep you from getting band 7 if it's really excessive, but is often the thing that keeps people from getting band 8. So like, part of coherence and cohesion is the paragraph structure and the way that each paragraph has its own idea that come from the bullet points, that you've got a sentence that explains clearly why you're writing, but also coherence and cohesion is about things like how sentences within the paragraphs fit together, how ideas transition from one to the next. And so if you follow a structure like this, you're not necessarily going to get 8. If your language is good, and so often you'll have someone who's got a logical structure which clearly lays out the information, their use of language is good, ideas flow from one to the next, but they use cohesive devices too often. So that will often keep people from getting band 8 for coherence and cohesion. So here I've definitely got plenty of cohesive devices. I've used them in the places where they're necessary. Okay, so find something unsatisfactory. That's a phrase. That's good. At present, that means now. Mainly cohesive device, explaining the main problem that I have. Selection of newspapers and magazines, a phrase. Cohesive device as. It. This is, I think there's only one in this. So a referencing device is simply referring back to something that you've already mentioned. Quite limited as it. So the selection of newspapers and magazines is quite limited as that selection contains only local periodicals. So if I said the selection of newspapers and magazines is quite limited as the selection of newspapers and magazines contains only local periodicals, that's very redundant. So if the main issue is not sounding too redundant the way I just did. And you'll often use pronouns for referencing devices. And so most people use these without thinking about it. But again, one of the reasons it's good to get feedback from someone who has training as an examiner is because this is specifically something that examiners look for. And I had never thought about this concept before I was an examiner. So I was an IELTS preparation teacher for a few years before that. And it's just something I didn't think about very much. I saw it in the band descriptors and I knew what a referencing device was, but I didn't know kind of the importance of that. Now, it's like vocabulary in general where, you should just use them naturally to communicate clearly. And if you do that, you'll be fine. And most people do that already. But if you get feedback that there's an issue with this, where you're not using them in places where you should, or you're using them in a way that's unnatural, then that's something you need to work on. Because again, for band 7 and coherence and cohesion and higher, you need to have good use of referencing devices. So another problem is, so I've got mainly another problem, so I'm listing my two problems, making that clear. Access to the library's digital collection, so access to something, and then the library's digital collection to do research. So that's not a particularly brilliant phrase in English, but it's one where people make mistakes a lot. So research is an uncountable noun in English. In many languages it's not. So people say make researches or do researches rather than do research. It's collocation. So it's a good use of digital archives, computer terminals rather than computers. Your goal should not to be to have this much highlighted vocabulary in your letters or in your essays. Your goal should be to communicate clearly. And so, for example, if you wrote computers instead of computer terminals, that would be fine. I mean, this is a bit less common of a term, and it's a term that I know. I'm a native English speaker. I'm comfortable using it, so I did. Don't be intimidated if you don't have this much good vocabulary. You don't need anywhere near this much to get band 7 or band 8. So suggestions I would like to make, so again, that's a set phrase. Expand something is a good word. Periodicals collection, so that's again referring to newspapers and magazines. For use by the public is a good phrase, a collocation. Alternatively, again, signaling a second solution that would also be acceptable to me. Institute an appointment system, that's a less common phrase. Ensure that patrons are people who use the library, have convenient access to something, digital services, again. So you can see a lot of the good vocabulary is simply collocations or set phrases that are used to describe things, or groups of fairly common words that are put together in a way that is not common. So thank you for your attention to this matter. Again, this is the type of sentence where if you can remember it, put it in. If you can't, if you don't know one for the particular situation you're writing about, it's not essential. It's not really going to make a huge difference in your score. Probably no difference. Although, if you can put something like that in, it's nice to show the examiner that you're aware of that convention of putting a final sort of sentiment like that. If you read a sample essay like this, you should essentially be using the sample essay for just a couple of things. Number one, vocabulary. So getting vocabulary that you can use. Also, if you're following a particular structure, then checking your essay to make sure that your essay is the same structure as the one that you're following. But generally, your answers to a question are going to vary and be different from someone else's. It doesn't mean that they're better or worse. What's important is development and how you have satisfied what's being asked in the question. So don't be disappointed if your answer is different than someone else's or than a sample answer. It doesn't mean that your answer is bad. Or if your ideas are the same, it doesn't mean your answer is good. Again, just focus on the important things that you need to do when you write a letter and get practice doing those things. Okay, so there it is, a formal letter to someone you don't know. So hopefully this was helpful. And if you need to work on your letters, have a look at the other materials on the website about the various aspects of Task 1 letter writing and the other types of letters. And make sure that you do plenty of practice on a variety of different types of letter in terms of formal, informal, and on a variety of topics. And if you do that, when it comes exam time, you shouldn't have any trouble at all.